here. So my name is Chris Liuzzo. I live also in upstate New York. In fact, maybe 10 or 15 minutes from Carol. She and I used to, we were actually colleagues at one time. Well, we are colleagues still, but we actually worked for the same organization at one time. I'm retired, sort of. I was in the service provider world here in New York for 40 plus years. And but I've been fortunate enough to keep my toe in the water of the work. I have a particular interest in shared living, have had since the late 80s. And over the course of my work, I think I helped maybe 50 or so people get into some sort of shared living arrangement. So I'm just here to talk a bit about that. I will keep my time to no more than 30 minutes, perhaps less, to give us time to talk. So I'm going to start my timer now, which will then tell me when to shut up. So there's that. I am going to share my screen. Pull this up. Get this over here. From there. Okay. So to begin with, I'd just like to give you this quote from the very well-known business writer, Peter Black, on the word how. If we were really committed to the pursuit of what matters, we might be well served to hold a moratorium on the question how. It would force us to engage in conversations about why we do what we do. It would create the space for longer discussions about purpose, about what is worth doing. It would refocus our attention on deciding what is the right question rather than what is the right answer. And I preface this presentation or talk about shared living with this quote from Peter, because it's really about why even consider shared living as an alternative to more traditional living options, and we'll get into that. Now, Marcus referenced that there's going to be an event November 3rd and 4th on shared living, a virtual international event to look at this subject. And several people, Fiona and Jonathan, will be telling their story during that event. And Carol and Marcus have been assisting me, along with about a dozen other people, to think about this event. And these quotes come from this group of a dozen or so people who've been helping me think about what is shared living all about. And the heart of it is relationship. And I will go more into that in a moment. But here's what some of my colleagues have been saying. Shared living is about relationships with people whose personhood has often been denied and who have often been seen as the other. And in this conference, this event, we're calling it a gathering. Among the questions we want to address are, how do we promote and protect these relationships? And how do we tell the story of genuine relationships between so-called valued persons and persons who have often been seen as even incapable of being in relationship? So these are among the things we want to explore in this November 3rd and 4th event. So what is it? And there are definitions abound about what is shared living, but most of the definitions that I've seen share some common elements. It's when persons with and without disabilities or other needs share their lives, especially in their domiciles and where they live, that they share living space. Typically, although not always, the person without a disability provides some support to the person with a disability, although the extent and the nature of those supports can vary widely. It is not, when done well, a placement of one person into another person's home, which is often the way it is done, especially here in New York State. It is, when done well, a mutually agreed upon arrangement. Now, I have expanded the definition here based on my work to say that it can encompass both persons who live together in the same four walls, the same apartment, the same home, and also those who live quite near to one another. For example, in adjacent apartments. So they might live, one person might live in apartment A and the other in apartment B, and they're separated by some sheetrock, but they are still in a mutual supportive relationship. And what got me going on this so many years ago was that I became so disillusioned with any form of group living that it's an alternative, one alternative to group living models, which are predicated on the shift, the 7 to 3, 3 to 11, and 11 to 7 factory model. And David, I see you are nodding your head. You're a nurse, so you know that routine. In shared living, typical staff-client relationships are disrupted, and the boundaries between work and personal lives become blurred. And I'll speak a bit more to that in a moment. Now, I have found very little research on shared living. So what I'm about to say is based on my experience, although in this event that we're going to sponsor in November, some folks out of the state of Pennsylvania are going to present some research that they have done on shared living arrangements, which I'm anxious to hear. But in my experience, what such arrangements tend to bring are, first and foremost, relationship. People are living together, and when you live together, you can't help but be in some form of relationship. Right? You're sharing space. So it really tends to disrupt that shift model where I'll see you tomorrow, and actually we live together and we are in relationship. It brings intimacy. You cannot live with someone without sharing their lives and them sharing yours. So, you hear things, you see things, you get to know someone's personal life in a way that most social service structures often even prohibit. So it really promotes mutual intimacy in a very beautiful way, I think. It blurs boundaries. That where my personal life and my work life and your personal life and your work life begin and end sort of goes away. And when I've talked to people who are the helpers, if we might use that word, the sharers in such situations, they almost always say, I don't know where my work life begins and my personal life ends because I live with so-and-so. And that's a wonderful thing because I don't feel like I'm working anymore. I am in relationship with the person I support. We live together. And yes, I have to do certain things. I might have forms I got to fill out, paper I've got to fill out, tasks I have to complete. But it feels like part of life now. It doesn't feel like a job. For the people who are receiving supports in such arrangements, these next three things I think are so important. One, it brings some stability. Although there is little research, my experience and those that people I've spoken with is that the turnover rate is very, very low. That people in life sharing arrangements tend to stick in those arrangements for years. I will tell you a story shortly of an example of that, giving an example of that. But here in the United States, the turnover rate of people who provide direct support in group living arrangements, group homes and day programs is north of 50%. And so that means every other person leaves someone's life every year. Yeah, but shared living arrangements tend to minimize that. And I know in nursing homes and other medical facilities in the United States, the turnover rate is even much higher than that, even approaching 80 and 90%. Spontaneity. I worked in group living arrangements for many, many years. And one thing that they do not have is spontaneity. If someone in a group living arrangement says, hey, Chris, can we go to the movies tonight? The inevitable answer is, We'll see. Maybe. We got to see who's going to call in sick or not call in sick. Oh, the van broke down. Oh. And the thousand reasons why we can't just go to the movies. But in the shared living arrangement, it's just one person with one person. And if someone says, let's go to the movies, you say, okay, what time do we want to go? We're not bound by the needs of 6 and 7 and 8 other people. Our lives are not bound up with the needs of those people. We can do what we want to do. We can be spontaneous. Predictability. If any of you have ever worked or lived in some kind of group arrangement, you know that it's who's going to be here tonight. And how many times did I hear people living in those people who receive supports say, who's working tonight? Who's, quote, doing the overnight? Who's going to be here in the morning? You go home and you don't know who's going to be there. And it seems to me that these three elements of stability, spontaneity, and predictability are part and parcel of being a healthy person when your life is stable, spontaneous, predictable. And if you don't have those things, it just seems to me your life is, well, very disrupted. And what it does to one's psyche to not to have this stability or spontaneity or predictability. They're extremely simple to understand. So when mom wants to know who supports my son, well, it's Mike. Mike lives with your son. It's not this enormous, complex bureaucratic structure. You know, who's the manager, who's the boss, who's the supervisor, who's the coordinator, all of these things. I know who supports my son, and he knows who supports him. It's very simple to understand. We live together. Boom. It provides far more control for families and people who receive supports. They actually do get to choose, when it's well done, who is their supporter. I like you, I hire you. I want you to live with me. Thank you very much. And group living arrangements often give voice to that. So, oh yeah, we have input, but the fact of the matter is that people who live in group living arrangements and their families have no control. And I can't tell you how many times as an administrator, a parent would say to me, who's that guy that you hired to work in my son's home? Right? He gives me the willies. I don't want him putting his hands on my son or my daughter. They have no control. And at least in the United States, and I think in some other countries, they're economically quite efficient. You can get a lot of bang for your buck. 24/7 supports when needed for well under the cost of a typical group living arrangement. Now, they do require safeguards. And like I said, the boundaries get blurred. So this quote at the bottom is from our good friend and colleague, Michael Kendrick, who is also one of the people advising us on this event. And what Michael says is, good design promotes an enriched quality of relationship between persons in provider and recipient roles, while ensuring the ethical conduct of supportive and developmental rather than custodial relationships. Good design promotes relationship between provider and recipient, while still ensuring their physical and social safety. So while so many professions say, we got to keep our boundaries, we have this code of ethics and so forth, we say in shared living, blur those boundaries, but in each case, how do we provide safety and security for both parties when we intentionally blur boundaries? So we have to think about that in each individual case. How do we safeguard people, even though while still encouraging the blurring of professional boundaries? Another safeguard is to safeguard the principle of subsidiarity, which just means simply the people who live in that living arrangement should be making the decisions about that living arrangement as much as possible. So we want to honor that. We want to say, this is your home. right? We want to promote the integrity of your household. We want to respect your privacy, but we have to balance that. This is a safeguard with transparency. We don't want a black hole that nobody can look into. So good service design is often about thoughtfully balancing and resolving apparent contradiction. In this case, to balance the need for transparency with the human needs for respect and privacy and autonomy. That's our challenge. It's not impossible. We don't want to be overly intrusive. And by the way, that's one of the other themes of our international event, is how to minimize bureaucratic and governmental intrusion into personal space while still keeping an eye on it. It's not impossible to do at all. It's a safeguard that's necessary. I still got a little bit of time, so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. The fellow over here, that's James, and this is Amy. James is a person who receives supports. He lives with Amy and her children, and he has for about 10 years now. She bought a house under the auspices of an organization that I worked for and Carol worked for at one time. Amy bought a house with sort of like an in-law kind of an apartment. At least that's what we refer to it here in the States. And James has just become part of her family. And as you can see, he's living the good life. And he's living a typical young person's life, young man's life, while still living with and actually becoming integral to Amy's family and with her kids. She just considers him part of the family, and he considers her part of his family. She's paid to do it. She does the necessary paperwork in the state of New York, but that doesn't look like work to me. And I think Amy and James would tell you the same thing. The other story I want to finish with is George and Brian's story. This is George. This is Brian. This is, I don't remember his name. This is George's son and George's son's wife, and I don't remember their names. At one time, George was the manager, the boss of a group home here in New York, for which I was responsible. It was an 8-person group home, and Brian lived in that group home. Carol, this would have been Brunswick Road in Troy. And it was one of the group homes that my colleagues and I were able to successfully close and disperse people into their own places. So as we were going about planning how to close this group home, we held person-centered planning sessions with each of the 8 people who lived there, Brian being one of them. And during the sessions with Brian, who is not good with language, he's hard to understand, but we think we got his point. We thought he was telling us, I would like to get out of here. I want to live in my own place, but I don't want to live totally alone. I want to live with somebody, but I want to live with somebody without a disability. We were pretty sure that's what Brian was telling us. Now, Brian has a brother who's not a guardian, but he's a brother sort of tangentially involved. His name is Wally. So we went to Wally, my colleagues and I, and we said to Wally, this is what we think Brian is telling us. And Wally said, as I've heard from other family members, and this is perhaps why shared living is not a big thing in the United States and doesn't even exist in some of the countries we've spoken to planning our event. Wally said, who'd want to live with him? That's a quote. My mother couldn't live with him. That's how he ended up in New York here, the Rome State School, which was an institution. That's how he ended up at Rome, because my mother couldn't live with him. Who'd want to live with him? And we said, well, Wally, we don't know yet, but we'd like to try. And Wally, again, this is a quote. He gave this little wave like this with his hand. And he said, you can go do your social work thing. So he didn't say no. So we took that as a blessing and we ran with it. A day or two later, George, the manager of this group home that we're going to close, came to my office and he said, this is when I knew we were on the right track. He said, I really have a good relationship with Brian. I have a lot of affection for him. And if he will have me, said George, I'd like to be the guy that lives with Brian. Okay. We know George. He's worked with us for years. He's a trustworthy fellow, good man. So George and I went over to see Brian. Sit down and George looks at Brian and says, hey, Brian, how about you and me? You and me live together. And Brian gives the double thumbs up. Yeah. Then we invited Wally, the brother. And George and I, Brian sat down with Wally. And George said to Wally, the brother, I think it would be me. If you're okay with this, Wally, I would like to live with Brian. And Wally started to cry. I'm getting emotional myself. Wally started to cry and said, I wish my mother could see this. They went on to live together for 10 plus years. And then they happily parted ways after 10 years. They still live near one another. I've spoken to George several times over the years. He says, Brian still calls him twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. So they still have a relationship for 10 good years. And I'll close early, which is fine. We can talk with I'll close if I can make the slide move. There we go. With this little sort of coda to this whole story. Here's George and Brian. We were having a retreat at a retreat center near where we live on right relationships. We learned from Michael Kendrick. And we focused on several people we thought were demonstrative of being in right relationships. We had a day-long retreat for our event. We had about 100 people there and 3 or 4 pairs of people up on the podium, up on the stage, telling their stories, George and Brian among them. Now, at the end of the day, it was a 6 or 7 hour day. We call the day to a close. Thank you all for being here. A lovely day. And as people begin to shuffle their chairs and go get their coats, we live in upstate New York. It's cold. Cold here. It wasn't cold that day, but they were getting their jackets and coats. You'll see that George plays the guitar. He's quite a musician, actually. So as people were leaving, he reached under his chair, George did, and he started playing the guitar. And suddenly, Brian, you can see here, takes a harmonica out of his shirt pocket and starts to play along with George. The room stops to watch them and listen. They play for a minute or 2 or 3. And, everybody erupts in applause. Beautiful. How? Wow. It was great. The next day after that, George sent me an email. And I'm going to read part of that email to you because I think it captures everything. So this is George writing to me. As I mentioned, Brian, has had that harmonica less than 2 weeks. He carries it with him everywhere, and I guess he likes it. We haven't had much occasion to play or to practice, maybe 20 minutes total so far. But it seemed to work okay. Well, there was a little trick to that musical performance. For it to work, Brian has to take the lead, a little bit at least, and I have to stay very tuned in to what he's doing and where he's going with that harp. Then it works. I could, of course, just set some heavy rhythm and drown him out, but that's what life has been like for him way too long. It was absolutely fantastic and as close to a miracle as I'll ever get in life. Thanks for allowing it to happen. Again, it was funny and indicative of the right relationship considerations. One person, a higher up from our agency and a person I greatly value, came up to me afterwards and said how wonderful the music was and that Brian was able to follow the beat incredibly well. The truth, Brian wasn't following. At least he wasn't following any more than I was following. He was leading for the most part. Actually, it was a team approach with us both having to listen and both lead and both follow. And I think that just captures the way George and Brian approach their whole relationship. We are in this together. It's reciprocal. We both lead. We both follow. We're with one another. I'm not over, at, on, or to Brian. He and I are just with one another. So that's why I like shared living, because when it works like that. And in the few instances where I've seen shared living not work, it's when the provider, the person without a disability, can't get out of the command and control mindset. I have to tell so-and-so to take a shower. He's got to do this, she's got to do that. When it doesn't work, almost always in my experience, the person receiving support says, I can't stand this anymore. It's failing because so-and-so won't stop bossing me around, essentially. Okay,